regulator, shareholders and customers, Dr. Altman was positioned to coordinate Telkom's strategic repositioning and turnaround. The early success of its program is reflected in its share value rising from $1.2 in May 2013 to $6.6 in August 2015. Real improvements in company financials, regulatory matters, customer service and market repositioning are evident, as is Telkom's emergence as government's lead broadband agency. Dr. Altman is also a commissioner on the National Planning Commission in the Office of the South African Presidency. She served in its first term from 2010 to 2015 and was reappointed for a second term in September 2015. This body was established to guide long-term planning for South Africa. She was previously Executive Director of the Human Science Research Council in South Africa. She's recognized as a leading economist, strategist, and thought leader. The Employment Scenarios Program was a flagship program at the SRC. This drew leaders from government, the private sector, labor, and academia together over a period of years to define a vision and practical strategies to advise extremely high unemployment in South Africa. The HSRC employment scenarios were heavily relied on in the conceptualization and direction of South Africa's first national development plan. Dr. Altman has led major public policy and development programs in urban renewal and industrial development. She was head of economic development in a multi-billion rand township rural program in Alexandra and project leader of the 1998 Employment Strategy and Presidential Job Summits. She regularly advises international, national, provincial, and municipal leaders on policy that advances efforts to stimulate the economy, promote employment, and reduce poverty. She has a BA in economics from McGill University, an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in economics from the University of Manchester. Dr. Altman has produced more than 100 publications. She was commissioning editor of approximately 400 policy papers and publications in her division at HSRC, and was guest editor of 4 special edition journals. She will soon launch her own website posting this work in partnership with South Africa's National Treasury. Please put your hands together and welcome the accomplished, oh my gosh,
I would have just said I work at Telkom and I'm on NBC. So half my time's up now. Well, thanks for having me. Do you mind if I just sit for a second and I'll get up just now? Well, thanks for having me. I think it's a really good time in relation to where we are in the National Planning Commission, because we're just getting going again. You know, we were I was reappointed, but there was a new commission appointed in September 2015, and I would say that it's largely a fresh new group of people, and we're starting to shape our agenda, and we're feeling quite motivated to have a bigger impact. In other words, we produced the plan. I think it did make a splash, but somehow we lost some momentum. And the reality is that the plan is used to frame national policy. There's no doubt about that. There's a whole process through the presidency to put pressure on departments, and each province then puts pressure on its departments. But you know, running government's a very complex thing, and the National Planning Commission needs to be doing work to make sure that there's good alignment, that we are mitigating against potential risks. But equally, it's for civil society, frankly, to also be looking at the plan and saying, you said you were going to do X about labor relations or food security. You know, what the hell happened? Where is it? And what can we do to be part of that? And to hold government to account, and to participate, and to organize communities. So this feels like a good group of people to be connecting with. At this stage, while we're framing our thinking, including how we're engaging in active citizenry, sort of stimulating active citizenry, because frankly, that's a big part of being part of a democracy. And people who disengage, I think have lost sight of that idea that being in a democracy, it's not always your people who are in power. The issue is that you have a continuous responsibility, if you live in a democracy throughout your life, or that's my view, to be engaged and driving change, improvement, holding government to account, and being involved in change yourself, which I don't think I have to convince anybody here. And I saw people's profiles, and I think everybody here is involved and engaged in their own area. But it's not generally the way that people understand it, maybe because we are still a new democracy. It may be. But as we mature, it's going to be a very important part. So I'll come back to it at the end of the talk to talk about maybe what some of your ideas are about how we should be driving implementation. Because people say, when are you going to implement? And actually the National Planning Commission doesn't implement anything. We're an advisory body. It's for all of us, government, private sector, civil society. Those sound like fine words, but it's actually true. If we don't come together, nothing will happen in this country. There's no way that government can deliver in any country everything that needs to be done. So now what I've done is I prepared a fairly lengthy presentation. I was asked to speak for an hour, and I think you'll be asleep if I talk for an hour. So I'm gonna give a bit of a presentation. The bulk of the presentation, the plan's really long, I recognize. I think you were given an overview in the last session. The plan itself is worth reading, particularly as a reference document, I think. People say it's long, but when you're covering this kind of material, there's no section that's longer than maybe 10 pages. So you've got to be a little bit granular in your thinking. So if you were worried about labor relations, as an example, there would be a very clear statement about what we're proposing around labor relations. And so it's really worth going to the plan and not the overview to see what the plan actually says about what needs to happen in energy policy or water or education or whatever it is. What I've done though, because the plan is so long, is that I added in the presentation for reference, and I don't know if that's printed out here, summary of the things that I think are important and what the plan says about those areas. There's loads of other stuff in the plan, but I've just lifted out stuff that I thought was relevant for today. I'm not going to go through it unless you want to, unless there's something in there that you want to talk about. But I thought for the purpose of your course, you might be happy to have that in hand. Okay? So you might, maybe while I'm talking, don't ignore me, but you might want to look at the back and just see what's there, just see if there's anything you want to talk about. That's my suggestion, insofar as it is printed out now.
Yes.
What do you have?
We're sharing copies, I think, between a couple people.
Okay. But you've got how many pages, how many slides have you got? Because I think they were printing, I think they got it late.
I think
What is the last slide?
41.
Yeah, you've got the whole thing. So you might flip through it and just see if there are areas that are, that are interesting. Now the last session, you got a feeling for what the plan's about? I don't want to repeat stuff.
We had a group discussion, so we had read the overview, and then we had a discussion amongst ourselves about what we thought was interesting. Yeah.
What did you think was most interesting? What came up? There's no right or wrong. So.
No, it's actually a question
about
NDP and how often do they update in terms of overview? Because in the State of the Nation's address, the President did agree to the fact that one of the objectives are that employment rates fall from by 6 to 14% by 2020, and obviously the President alluded that that's not going to happen. So what adjustments, because that should have a trickle down effect, that makes sense. So how often is the plan adjusted?
So the plan is never adjusted.
Okay.
The plan, what we proposed, I think is still true. Those particular numbers though, I produced those numbers. So you'll see there's a note in here actually that says it needs to be updated. In fact, that was an internal note to myself, and I just forgot to cut it. But I have to remodel that because clearly we're not going to make those targets. The problem with changing targets, and it's clear we're not going to make those targets, the problem with changing targets is it changes the aspiration. And the reality is we have to get to full employment or fuller employment. This 25% unemployment, it's not just actually something that's happened since 1994. It was building up over 30 years. And it's something that just sticks in this economy, and we absolutely must do something about it. So in terms of the diagnostic and what we think needs to happen, it's still all the same stuff. But those numbers probably do need to be revised And again, the discomfort that I have in doing that is that they're meant to be aspirational. They're meant to say, guys, can we please get our act together? Because we keep, originally we were supposed to get to having unemployment by 2014. We missed that. We were supposed to be at 14% unemployment by 2014. And we said, oops, there was a downturn. So now we'll aim for 2020. Now we're going to say, what? Let's get to 14% by 2030. Are we fine with that? Now, it may be realistic, but the whole point is to push people along and get people motivated to do better than what we've been doing. It's not meant to be a status quo document. It's meant to say, guys, we need structural change, and we need to get moving. So that's that. But your point is quite true. But we have no intention of revising the plan itself. Maybe the numbers, but not the plan itself.
But are there will there be like a 2020 progress or 2017? Like, will there be kind of not necessarily remodeling the document itself, but assessments of?
Well, we do that all the time.
Okay.
So there's we have now been merged with a sister ministry called Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, and their job is to write the performance agreements with ministers that are predicated on the NDP. And in other words, they have to adopt these targets. So it may be that we don't get to the employment targets, but we should be getting to food security targets. Say vitamin A, etc. Stuff like that. There's no reason why we shouldn't be getting to those targets. Or one of the targets is something, I may be getting it wrong, but something like, it might have been 50% of all matrics should pass with 50%. It's something like that. Whereas now it's something like 7%. Or it's very, very low. And so I may be getting the target wrong, but there's absolutely no reason, even in a downturn, why we can't achieve that. So their targets would be aligned with those targets. And then there's a report every year. And then there's the medium-term strategic framework that runs for 3 to 5 years, and everything's lined up with that. So we do the 2030 thinking and the long-term alignment. Then they have a 5-year plan, and then we have a 3-year budgeting cycle. And then every year there's a report card, basically.
Okay.
That will say where everyone is. Unfortunately, nobody gets fired for performance yet. Until that happens, it's going to be hard to turn the screws. Please?
What's the name of the report?
Which report?
The report that will be submitted every year.
It should be on the website. It's made publicly available.
Yes, just the name.
I don't know what it's called. It might be development indicators, or you can look on the presidency website. It should all be there. Government's pretty transparent about this stuff. Sometimes it's embarrassing, but it's posted. Like the education statistics are very sad, but they're posted. And that at least is something, so that we can mark the small improvements that happen each year and push harder. So I think government's pretty open about that stuff. Yes? Hi. Fine.
So I'm just looking at the dates and the timings between the evaluation and approval. April 2012 and 2010.
Yeah?
And onwards. I have a constant question as I go down to these figures. The constant question is in 2010, when after President Zuma appoints the commission, the diagnostic report, for 12 months, April 2010 and then 2011 June. It's 12 months. I think yes, it's 14 months in between there. The processes of diagnosing the problem that was going to lead the report. How much of the population, how much of the messages were included with somehow the outreach of it to the masses in the process of trying to find out what is the problem, how much was that, and how much of the masses keeps on following on this, as in knowing that since 2010 this is what the government intended to implement, and then this how far they are, etc.
So there was, it's one of the reasons why it takes a while to produce a document like this. Firstly, it's not like a researcher sitting down and writing something that they think is interesting. or even one ministry. You've got 26 people with divergent ideologies from different backgrounds. So that group itself, in a way, has connections in different parts of society. And we had to come together as a group. And then there was extensive consultation nationally. And so that's one of the reasons why it takes such a long time to form as a group, work out what we want to focus on, connect in civil society and across government. I think it's one of the reasons why we did get approval across all parties in Parliament. Could we do better in engagement? I think so. I think also government generally could be engaging in society differently. It's something that I'm doing, which I can talk about later, where I'm experimenting with the Equerleni Junior Council right now to look at how we can get active citizenry going, where civil society is leading change and framing change in relation to the plan, rather than government coming and saying this is how it's going to work. I think the way that Pravin Gordon has been engaging with business lately is also a good marker of how things could go differently, rather than being spoken to, getting people engaged in the solutions. So could we do better? Absolutely. And we've done what was in our power and our resources, in connecting around the country. Yes?
So I've just been reading the thing on, the section on education, the summarized points, and also like looking in terms of the stats for education and what's being done, etc. So I feel like the government has made a lot of improvements or has reached a lot of milestones in terms of the equity issue within education. So we've improved access, especially with the whole no-fee schools for 1, 2, 3 quartiles. So now I'm trying to understand what is the actual plan to address inequality, because of course equity and equality aren't the same thing.
Absolutely.
So what is the plan? Like, because I mean the way things are right now, it seems as though our education system is pretty much reproducing inequality, because you find that funding goes to Model C schools more, because 90% of schools' budgets need to go to teacher salaries. And of course, at Model C schools, teachers will be paid more. So obviously, they'll be given more money to be able to pay. And also another thing, like, I think it was released in 2011 or 2013, stats saying that over 75% of our teachers aren't actually qualified, meaning that they don't have the 4 or 5 year Bachelor of Education qualification. So what is the plan to address that?
So can I make a suggestion? Let's talk about the high level plan first. Education certainly is something we see as a top priority, and I'm not an education expert per se, but we could have a discussion about that when we start getting into certain areas. Is that okay? Otherwise we might deep dive into one area and then not get the big picture. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now I'll get across now, and maybe that's a point of debate, because on the commission always, not everyone has agreed with me. My personal view, I'm not saying the view of the commission, my personal view about how we deal with inequality in South Africa, and you might think this is lame, is that we actually have to deal with poverty. And there's so much that is within our power to lift up society and create access for people to a reasonable standard of living and a decent standard of living, which is an idea that the Planning Commission will take up this time. It's a theme I was pushing quite hard on last time. And when I was at the HSRC, was doing a lot of thinking about how you create not just a floor, but a decent standard of living. You almost create a South African dream, which is a very basic one. It's just, even if you live under a bridge, you can get an education, your kid can get educated, your kid could go to college. It's got nothing to do with socioeconomic class. It's good for the country, it's good for the population, and that's what's going to drive equality down the road. Often in the inequality discussions, we think about the allocation of resources, what we're doing like wealth taxes and that kind of thing. I don't know that, obviously those things are important, but my personal view is there's a lot we can do to merge classes and reduce the the barriers that are created by class through better quality public services. So that's my, like I said, that's my personal view. There are people on the commission who don't agree with me, and I have to say what I think. So I can't represent another view because I don't understand it. I try to stay very focused on doables. You know, education as an asset is, in my view, the most important asset that people can have, and that people are, that the pass rates are so low, and the quality of what people are getting when they come out is so poor. It holds the country back, and it also keeps us unequal. It means that people can't move forward based on capability, inherent capability. So I personally like focusing on stuff like that gives me a doable, something that's clear. Sometimes I feel that inequality becomes an abstract idea, and I don't know what to do about it when it gets talked about like that. I'd rather be thinking about women's health, early child development, and the capabilities of kids from age 0 to 3. I'm very engaged in nutrition and food security, almost an activist. You know, those are things that are going to make a huge step change in human capability and the ability of people to move forward. I understand those discussions. I don't understand loose discussions about inequality, but that's just me. Other people may not agree with me. And you know, maybe that's a debate we could have when we do an overview. It's quite an emotional issue as well for most people, for obvious reasons, because this country is so unequal. Should I maybe get stuck in? It gives me a feeling for where people are. I didn't want to bore you with details about, you know, blah, 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 the bureaucracy around the planet. I put it in because I'm supposed to, but, you know.
No, it's
No,
it's okay. I think we can move ahead.
okay. Well, you know, so the plan. If I could just say, so we developed this plan. It was supposed to give vision. When people refer to 11 million jobs, they say, oh, you're out of your tree, or you're never going to do that. But that's not really the point. The point isn't to say, here's some, you know, yeah, it's based on science, but it's meant to be an aspiration. It's meant to say, this is what the country should look like through lots of dialogue with people, actually, lots of thinking about what people want, what society could look like realistically, and what needs to be done to get there. It doesn't mean that it'll be done. It means that in our view, this is what needs to be done to get there. If you don't do it, you won't get there. And that's what we're finding now. It's not just the global downturn that's putting us at risk. It's a whole lot of other things around energy policy, water, education, a whole lot of other things that just stop us in our tracks, that we have imposed on ourselves. Right? So things would have been bad anyway because of the commodity downturn globally, but we make it worse. And so our point is, so don't make it worse. Let's improve governance, accountability, delivery on these basic things, and things would be better. They wouldn't be perfect, but they would certainly be better. And we have to galvanize behind that. That's what these numbers are really about. You know, so the issue isn't to be skeptical. The issue is to say, how do I get behind this, you know, to change our world? That's really what the idea is. Now, what's great about it is we're an advisory body, and we don't have executive power. And so in a way that weakens us, and it also strengthens us. It requires a certain amount of maturity because we only have influencing power. When the president, Zuma, when we first were established and when we were reestablished, he said the same thing. You would be surprised maybe to know. He said, you don't have to agree with the policies of the day. You should be helping us mitigate against significant risk. So you should be telling us where we're going wrong. Doesn't mean the government will agree, but we should be doing that. He specifically gave us marching orders in that vein. So in the last commission, as an example, I think you're aware that nuclear policy is very controversial. Our expert, Anton Eberhard, who on energy, was very vocal about his concerns around nuclear policy. And we still exist. We were still established with the same kind of group. And the plan, which need not have been approved I should say, was approved by Cabinet and by all parties in Parliament, which was quite an achievement. So in a way, if you have executive power, you have to agree with the policy of the day. If you don't have executive authority and only influencing power, you're still in the presidency communicating about key issues and points of debate, which we then have to influence people to come to our view. That gives us a different kind of power, because we can say things that bureaucrats and politicians can't say, because they are part of the party, they are part of the executive, and they have to be accountable to that body, whereas we don't. We're just an advisory body. So in a weird way, it gives us a different kind of influencing power. So as an example, one of the things that I'm sure we're going to be raising now, I'm pushing for it and I think we will, is, for example, around spatial planning, which just isn't going right yet. We had advocated densification, right? Land should be appropriated, actually, and housing settlements should be probably more difficult to acquire, but cheaper to develop. It's easier to deliver services, people are closer to jobs, it would bring the cost of delivery down. That's an efficiency requirement in government right now. But what's happening is that housing policy is still taking the approach of finding the easiest to acquire land far from agglomerations in central areas in the city, and that flies in the face of transport policy, which is focused on rapid transit, densification, and so on. So I think one of the big themes we're going to be driving in the next phase is to get that squared, is to get that aligned. Now, it might be harder to do it in government, right? Because you're jostling within cabinet. But we can say it because we're just saying, guys, there's a problem here. Let's line up, let's get discussion, let's influence everybody. If you don't want to do it, so don't do it. But we're going to make people aware of that debate, understand it, put out evidence, so all of society can also weigh in on the issue and become vocal about it. And then hopefully it will get aligned. We may succeed or we may fail, but we have the opportunity to try. With that, did you want to say something?
No, I think this is the big thing, is like, yes, I mean, from your perspective, there is that extra power that's given because you're not seated within government, so to speak. But it's also where the limpness of the document comes from. That you can't hold anybody to account for not implementing anything because you're just advising.
Well, no, you can, because the document, we're just advising, but the NDP was approved by Cabinet and approved by all parties in Parliament. So you can hold them to account, actually, and that's the whole point. So when it says you're supposed to be doing X, Y, Z on food security, so why didn't you do it? You approved this plan. Government's not going to implement every single part of it. It's just physically impossible. But the point is that it's possible then to go and say you were supposed to do regulatory impact analysis every time you come up with a policy that influences small business, but you're not doing it. What happened? You must do it. You see, that's how it works. Have people seen, my favorite explanation of the plan is the Tundi YouTube video that we have. Has anybody seen that? It's a 6-minute video, and I wanted to share it with you because I think it's, for me, the most important message about how the plan comes together. Yeah? And I'm hoping my Bluetooth speaker works. We might need to be just quiet.
You may ask why government needs
Can you hear?
Surely it has so much power.
No.
It can pass laws in Parliament, it can employ people, it can design policy. But what we've seen is South Africa, and the story told by the diagnostic released by the National Planning Commission
Let me stop it and start.
is that things go wrong.
Oh, come on.
And it's very important to understand what goes wrong and to fix it.
Come on.
It's for this reason
Let me start again.
that the Planning Commission
Okay.
is set up to try and
Go
bring
back to
these
the
issues
beginning.
together and focus on the future. You may ask why government
You think I
needs
should go to
planning.
the previous slide?
Yeah.
I could otherwise just find it in a different. It all worked today. Are we
You may
online?
ask why government needs a plan function.
I can also get it on
Surely it
YouTube.
has so much power, it can
I think that would probably be the best thing to do. If you can connect to the Wi-Fi, I could help you do that.
Oh well. And I was being so clever.
Sorry about that.
Okay. What am I looking for?
Probably if you just hit escape once.
Yeah. Let me just try this one. No, still, isn't that funny? I've got it loaded somewhere else. It might be correct. Sorry, guys. And I was being so clever. I tested it, and it was working so nicely. And you can see all my secrets.
50th birthday party, what?
Come on. That's not me.
That you're clearly planning for something.
Oh, must be somebody else. Yeah, we're just gonna
We'll
move
just
from
wait for
there. Here. Let me see if this is gonna work. I hope so. There we go.
You may ask why government needs a planning function. Surely it has so much power, it can pass laws in parliament, it can employ people, it can design policies. What we've seen in South Africa and the story told by the diagnostic released by the National Planning Commission is that things go wrong. And it's very important to understand what goes wrong and to fix it. It's for this reason that the Planning Commission was set up to try and bring these issues together and focus on the future. So let's take all of these stories together and let me share with you the story of Thandi. Thandi is a young African woman, 18 years old, passed grade 12 in 2010. She was part of a group of just under 1.4 million 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds who started school together in January 1999. But so many of those who started with her dropped out at various points. The bulk of them, some 46% in fact, drop out at high school between grades 8 and 12. So that the people who come through the system, there were only 600 and odd thousand left of Thandi's group by the time they sat to write grade 12. 30% attained education sufficient to get them into university, and a further 12% allowing them to enter a college to do a diploma. So it's a very small, 25% of those who started have the opportunity to take things further. But out of that entire group, somebody like Thandi, who went to a school where virtually everybody is poor and African, and because she is a female, her chances were only 4% to get into university. Getting a university pass does not automatically mean that she would attend university. In Thandi's case, she couldn't. Financial and other reasons compelled her to remain at home and look for a job. In the first year, 2011, there was only a 13% chance that she would get a job. In fact, if one were to project this over the first 5 years after school, there's only a 1 in 4 chance that she would get a job. And once she has a job of earning an income above the median of 4,000 Rand a month is down to a mere 2%. 1 in 50 of people who leave school will earn more than 4,000 Rand a month in the first 5 years after school. She's likely to get a bit of piecework here and there. It may last a few weeks in one case, a few months in another case. But for that period, and for, in fact, all of her working life, it's unlikely that she will earn above the poverty line of 418 Rand a month. So this means for all of her childbearing years, she will be trapped in poverty. Her children will be born in poverty. The cycle of poverty will continue. In fact, ironically, the first time that she's likely to break through the poverty barrier would be when she turns 60 and then gets a state old age pension. It's an important story to understand because there are so many Tandis in South Africa. Education is a fundamentally important part of it, but it's not the only part. Access to healthcare, access to community services, whether this be water, electricity, sanitation, or broadband, access to public transport, whether there's a library in the community or not. All of these are fundamentally important parts of trying to improve on the lives of people in South Africa. And it's in understanding the story of Thandi that we can bring all of these issues together, bring them home, and ensure that the country can focus attention on every aspect of what needs to be done. We need coordinated and focused implementation. This will only happen if there's leadership within the country, within the province, within the village, within the school, within Thandi's peers. Everything needs to come together. We must ensure that leadership is interested, focused, and determined to drive the changes together. This is what brings planning into play that makes it so important in South Africa now.
The national plan has to attack the right of poverty and exclusion and nurture economic growth at one and the same time. This will create a virtuous cycle of expanding opportunities, building of capabilities, reducing poverty, all of it involving communities in their own development and leading to rising living standards. Such a virtuous cycle requires agreement across society about the contribution and sacrifices of all sectors and interests. This will translate into greater confidence and a greater field of opportunities for individuals and the country. Growth and development and reducing poverty and inequality are the core elements of this virtuous cycle. Strong leadership throughout society, national consensus, social cohesion, and a capable state are its key enablers. For the virtuous cycle to work, you don't only need them, you need everybody. And the success of whether it's working is in the lives of the millions of people who, like Thandi, face the struggle to improve on the quality of their lives. That is the change that the plan must bring. That is the new form of accountability. That is the shift from where we've been to something new. It's a new story about South Africa, one that we will build together. Thank you very much for your interest in the life of
So let's go back. Okay, so hello. So you know what I like about that video is, and I'll just get stuck in a little bit before we talk about it. When I was at the HSRC, I was running this employment scenarios. Come on, people. Murphy's Law, right? Seriously. And then probably it's not going to come. That is hilarious. I don't even want a device. Come on. There we go. Yay.
Oops.
No, it'll come. That's what happened last time. Okay. Whew. Okay. So, when I was at the HSRC, I ran a process which I started in the early 2000s when the ANC said, okay, and government said, okay, we are adopting a target not just to reduce unemployment, but we want to have unemployment, like an MDG type target. So I said, okay, if that's your most important target, what does that mean? Let's grab onto that. That's what they said. So brought all kinds of leaders around, and over about a decade developed scientific work and led dialogue to start influencing this issue. The Tundi video was it's very dear to me because we were doing a lot of work on the issue of working poverty, and the fact that so many working people in this country, and the Tundi story is almost every woman. Maybe I'm trying to think of what it is, but it's something like 25 to 50% of African women are domestic workers. So it really is like every woman. And if you're not a domestic worker, you're something like that. Maybe an office cleaner is a better job, but that it's not significantly better. And very few women and very few people are breaking out. And you work your whole life, and you're still in deep poverty. And so the issue was partly how do we deal with unemployment, but we have a development path problem that we were trying to address. And that was really, those were some of the things we learned. So in a way we had a decade-long diagnostic about different issues, and also a decade-long set of dialogues about what to do about each of these issues. And that really helped us when we got into the National Planning Commission. A bunch of us were part of that process. Joel Nchatinze, a whole range of Bobby Godsall, a whole range of people who were part of the Employment Scenarios Group. As it happens, were on the first National Planning Commission as well. And so that helped us a lot, that work had been done. And then we could lead dialogue around the National Development Plan with it. So part of one of the first questions that we asked, and I was told that we wanted to talk about the economy, or am I wrong? Do you want to talk about the economy? And the way that I think about the economy does link to the social, just to say. So I'm gonna now lift up about a mile high now, just to get an overview picture, which is, the first question we asked when we started the plan was, what kind of economy do we want to have? What kind of society do we want to have? And you had some people who would say, well, I think we should be a developed country. I think we should be a high-income country. And my personal view, and really one that I think emerged in the plan, was, look, if you could have people living truly in a middle-income country, which is what we are, not in a middle-income country and people who are destitute, who really live in a low-income country. That's how most people live. That's true across Africa, by the way. It's not just true in South Africa. It's a minerals economy problem, which I'll come to. If by 2030, most people in this country, maybe a few percent don't, but most people experience what it's like to truly live in a middle-income country, we would have made such incredible progress, because that is not the experience of most people in this country. And that's something we talked about a lot. That's partly the equity story. And it spoke to, how we need to think about public policy, therefore. So we need what does inclusive growth mean? It's a country that, grows in a way that creates employment. The fact is that growth is important. We had a lot of fights about this thing, and I'm sorry, I'm an economist. We have to grow. If you don't grow, you're just sharing, a percentage of nothing is nothing. Growing is what stimulates jobs. It generates more momentum. It creates a positive energy. The economy needs to grow. It's just a fact. But what you want to do is create employment on top of that. And the problem is that our economic policies have been very capital intensive over the years. They won't be anymore simply because we're in a commodity downturn and our energy has become scarce. It used to be that our energy was abundant, and therefore our industrial policy was very focused on using energy because it was so cheap. But those days are gone now. So we have to start moving our industrial policy to one that is much more services orientated, and I'll come to that. The second issue is that social services and wage goods mean the bulk of things that working people buy. So that means food, education, health, transport, housing, anything like that, whether it's publicly or socially provided. It should be affordable and accessible so that the majority can achieve a decent standard of living. That what the Tundi story is meant to say is that the probability of success is so low that you can't expect special people. We all know people who break out, but you have to be extraordinarily special. You shouldn't be. It should be the average person who is reasonably motivated, who can, even if you live under a bridge, push your kid, do your homework, finish school, get into a community college or some kind of post-school education, that being poor is not the marker of where your kids can go, so that you can start getting, improvements in intergenerational wealth transfer. The problem is that poverty is passed on from generation to generation because it's so unlikely that someone will break out. Now, the reason we focused on education and why it's so important is that you remember that he's saying, of those kids, I don't know if you saw that statistic, it was one we generated off the work we did at the HSRC, is that of the kids who were born in around 1990, 7% finished high school in matric, I forget, 18 years later, I forget what year now, maybe it was 2010, yeah, with the equivalent of a 50% pass in matric, right? So 7% of kids who were born in 1990 ultimately finished matric with the equivalent of 50%. Now in my book, and I hire people, I wouldn't hire somebody who has a 50%, personally. They don't know much. I mean, that is just the reality. I think somebody who finishes the matric is a highly motivated person, and there's a lot you can do, and I've been leading a lot of discussions about what one can do to develop people who do that. But frankly, as an employer, it's not worth much, because they don't see you. They don't see that you're a motivated person. They just know that you are a person who came away with high school with not a lot of education. That is just the fact. That organizations like Harambee and so on are working with people to lift people up is something where they've innovated and found where the capabilities are and where we can advance people. But the reality is we're creating a human base or a base of people who aren't ready for a modern economy. They're not E-enabled, they haven't got basic reading comprehension, basic numeracy. You don't have to shoot the lights out, but you do have to have certain capabilities to traverse the economy. And having some post-school education, a grade 9 is a perfectly reasonable high school education for most people if it's a high-quality grade 9, and then you can move into a high-quality FET. Right now, the people who pass FET are those who finish matric, but people who finish grade 9 don't finish it. So as I say, it's not so much that it's a problem that so many people drop out, between grade 10 and 12. Not everybody needs a matric. For most jobs, you don't, like security, whatever, you don't need it. But you do need a very high quality grade 9. And like I say, a reasonable, and then you're able to be trained. So the cost to employers, to further education institutions is just too high because people are coming in without basic capabilities. So the probability of success needs to be higher. The average person needs to be, with a good sense of motivation, but the average person needs to be able to access reasonable opportunity, and that speaks to ECD, what I was talking about earlier, that kids between 0 and 3 should be getting certain cognitive development, certain levels of nutrition so they can get started in school, they should be eating in school, teachers should be there, they should be physically present, they should be teaching, they should understand the curriculum, and so it goes, so that people have a reasonable chance of success if they're motivated. And motivation should really be what it's about, not socioeconomic class. And that's really the Tundi story. And then there should be channels to influence factors that influence citizens' well-being. People should have voice, and they should have channels to express themselves. And the problem right now is that I don't think people feel that they have those channels, and therefore people are pushing out. So you see buildings burned and, administration blocks burned down and whatever's going on, but people aren't feeling that there's that channel. And I guess that's where you guys come in as well, to think, well, what are those channels? How do we strengthen them? How do we create positive change so that people can articulate specifically and realistically what they want? How can they be engaged in that change? What should they be asking for? Because if you can get people focused at least on one or two things, then there's so many things that are wrong. You can't change everything, but you can get people positively focused on practical and progressive change. And right now, I think people aren't quite sure what they should be expecting and demanding. For example, the principal in the school should have certain capabilities. The teachers should have certain capabilities. They should be there. They should pitch on time. Stuff like that is something that parents should be demanding. It's in the plan. And people should know that they have that responsibility as a parent. Parents get pushed away from schools. They should be encouraged to be active participants in their children's education and in holding schools to account. That's just one example of a practical change that would make a difference in schools around the country. And that's how the plan will get implemented. You've got to strike fear in people's hearts is the reality. I mean, we all know that. If you want to hold officials, I don't mean that literally. I'm being recorded. But the reality is, community engagement is the most terrifying thing. I mean, we all know that. When politicians come and communities are making very clear and concrete demands, or you're going to the school and demanding what you need, it's the most terrifying thing. It's much less terrifying through other channels, frankly. Going to Parliament. I mean, we know this, right? So we talked about what kind of country do we want to be. And, the reality is I think people sometimes feel skeptical about the growth word, but the reality is we need to grow. I've positioned, for the, this is something I've recreated. It was one of the first slides that I presented when we started talking about it in the commission is, there are countries like Korea that have moved from being a poor country to being a wealthy country and a high-income country. Very few middle-income countries have managed to do that. Korea is an outstanding example. You can't even find a poverty rate in Korea. Incredible things around education, industrial development, a lot of other problems, but nevertheless they've made huge progress. But you get other countries like Nigeria that actually grew very fast over a period because of oil. They didn't invest in industry. They haven't really done much about their cities and urban development. And poverty rates actually, while growth improved dramatically, poverty rates also actually rose. It's not just that they were stagnant or fell more slowly. People became more poor in Nigeria. And that's where people become skeptical about the growth word, because sometimes it doesn't mean that much. And in a Nigeria context or a Venezuelan context, you see that kind of situation. And now Nigeria is feeling it with the oil price collapsing, and they didn't invest appropriately over the years while they had an oil boom. Frankly, we have the same problem. It's not as extreme, but the problem is minerals economies like South Africa, economies that mainly export minerals, and oil exporters are more extreme, tend to, the problem with these countries is you don't need people. You don't need people to progress. If you don't have oil, minerals, you have to depend on your people, because your exports and your industry require people, because you have nothing else. So it's a weird thing that minerals economies tend to lag behind. They tend to have smaller manufacturing base. They tend to have higher unemployment, higher inflation, all of these problems. And countries that don't have the resources, I'm not saying they all do, but the countries that have really powered ahead, like Korea, don't have resources. Now, what happens in a commodity boom, it's very common, and it happened in South Africa, is that policymakers and everybody in the country, it's a bit like cotton candy. Your economy's going well. It's an economic issue, but your exchange rate appreciates. It makes imports cheaper. The retail sector booms. Lots of jobs get created as a result, and that's what happened in South Africa. Whatever anyone thinks, a lot of jobs were created over the period of growth. It was a very labor-intensive, very labor-absorbing path. We don't feel it was because we have such high unemployment rates, but the reality is that there was a very high employment growth over the period of, I'm going to lose track, but say 2006 and 2008, 2009. Or particularly from the early 2000s, I would say. From the early 2000s to maybe 2008. Now the problem is we weren't investing appropriately in R&D, industry, industrial development, value-add exports aside from minerals, because the minerals exports make you feel that you're doing okay, and it kind of relaxes policymakers. It blinds you to what's really going on. When the commodity cycle falls, which it inevitably does, the market always goes up and down. when the commodity cycle collapses, it exposes the problem. And now you're left with maybe less manufacturing capability, less industrial capability than you had. You haven't developed your population, and you're further behind, and you don't have the resources to do anything about it. That's the situation we're in now. That's the problem. So while people sometimes get upset about, the constraints we impose on the budget, it's incredibly important in making sure that we still have the resources flowing so that our debt doesn't get too high, our interest payments don't get too high, and that we have some money for social spending, further investments in standard enterprise, and so forth. Now, so the problem in Africa, it's true right across Africa. The middle-income countries like South Africa, what would you say are the other middle-income countries? What comes to mind? What are middle-income countries in Africa? What would you say? Sorry? Botswana? Uh-huh. Lower middle, maybe. What else? Maybe they've reached lower middle at a stretch. Did you say Namibia? Yeah? DRC? DRC is a middle-income country. Do you see the problem? Do you see the problem? Lesotho, is not Lesotho, but Botswana is a middle-income country. How much industry do they have? Very little. Namibia, same. DRC,
Cape Verde.
I'm not sure. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, the point is, these are, they're middle-income country in name. By ratio of GDP to population, they're middle income. But in truth, they're countries that have some rich people, lots of minerals exports, and loads of poor people that basically live in low-income countries. Right? That's the problem in Africa. Because of this lack of commitment to investment. There are very few countries that break out, but there are examples. So countries like Malaysia, Mexico, Indonesia, there are some countries that have had long-range, Chile, that have had consistent commitment to breaking out of what we call a resource curse, where you're breaking free, you're expanding your value-added exports, you're investing in people, which is critical. It's why Canada and Australia are rich countries. Frankly, they're mineral exports too, but they've invested heavily in people. They've also imported a lot of skilled people, but there's a big investment in having a strong skills base and a very healthy population, something that's not happening in these African countries. So what we were doing was we were saying, what kind of country do we want to be amongst this range of countries along the spectrum? Did you want to add something? You had your hand up. Have I exhausted you already?
No, I see you still explain.
Okay, maybe I should just go through this part of it. So, now, okay, I've raised the resource curse problem. Part of what happens, and this is an economic issue, is one of the things we have in South Africa is a very volatile exchange rate. Everybody's talking about the rand going to 16, 15, 14, 16, 20, oh my God, that sort of thing. It'll probably go back to 13, maybe even 8 at one stage. We have a very volatile currency. We have a particularly volatile currency because we have a very deep financial market. And it enables foreign investors to come to South Africa, which they invest in commodity currencies. They invest in countries on block, countries that are like South Africa. It's a category, and it's very easy to invest in South Africa because of the fluid stock exchange, a very strong bond market, that kind of thing. So we have what they call a liquid currency market, and one of the most volatile exchange rates in the world. That may seem like a very abstract issue, but it's really not. And the Reason for that is, firstly, these financial flows, but secondly, our exports are very tied to commodity cycles. Okay? We're called a small, open economy. If you have a big domestic market like the United States does, you have less of a problem. That's why Nigeria's story is such a travesty, because having a big population is actually something that can be to benefit of a growth strategy, and it can really stabilize an economy like it does for the United States. Because the United States is also a commodity exporter, but it's got such a big domestic market. So countries like Brazil, China, India, they all have that benefit in reality. We don't have that benefit. We've got a small population, and we're very reliant on commodity cycles. The way of getting out of this trap is to invest in industry, is to invest in service exports, and I'll come to that just now, and is to step-by-step break out. If you read the diagnostic, not necessarily in the overview, but in the main plan, or the diagnostic we produced before the plan, basically we make the point that instead of moving ahead in expanding our value-add exports, in other words, exports that are not commodities, we've gone backwards. That's a huge problem for the country. That may seem like not something important for poverty reduction, but it's hugely important. It is hugely important, because what it does is the more value-add exports you have, like manufacturing and services, even sort of higher value exports to agriculture like wine, that kind of thing, the less exposed you are to commodity cycles, the less volatile the economy is. Now, who is most affected by these things? It's the poor, who are most affected by inflation, and small businesses, who are most affected by these cycles, right? And manufacturing businesses that are deeply affected by this volatility, and so firms think, well, it's just too difficult to do this, we're not going to invest. And that's why minerals economies tend to have very small manufacturing sectors as compared to other countries. It's harder to get it, and therefore you need a policy commitment that is very forceful and persistent and consistent. One of the challenges we have in South Africa is that we're constantly chopping and changing, so businesses don't know what do you know, they just can't, finally businesses say, you know what, it's okay, I'm going to import. It's so much easier, right? There have to be policies that are so clear and so beneficial to investing, to break through, particularly in countries like South Africa, where you've got the resource, because it works against the incentive structure that investors need to develop those new industries. Now, again, you might think, well, who cares? We care about the poor. If we don't do that, we don't have the fiscal resources. In other words, it means the country doesn't grow, the jobs aren't created, we don't have the stability that enables the next round of investment. Because what happens is manufacturers, they invest to some extent, but they don't invest long range, because they don't know where things are going, because there's so much volatility, right? So if you don't have that, you're not raising the tax revenue, you can't pay for education, social grants. That's the kind of cycle that one thinks about. Do you want to?
I just wanted to ask you if you could give just a brief snapshot of mineral beneficiation and why that has collapsed.
Okay, could you hold that question? I'll come to it. I've got a slide in the back about that, and we could talk about that. Okay, so that's one part. I haven't lost everybody, but these are incredibly important connections. Then the second thing with a middle income trap, it's an expression, I don't know if you've heard it, but a lot of middle income countries get stuck. And one of the reasons is that they don't invest sufficiently in product and technology. So I think we see R&D, research and development, as something that's a luxury. For an economy like South Africa, it's incredibly important to own our own brands, our own products, and to be driving scientific capability and innovation. Again, it's seen as a luxury, I think, when you've got problems that kids aren't eating. But unfortunately, if we want to start breaking out and growing, we have to own our own products and be developing our own products. The reason for that is that once you're a middle-income country, you have a certain cost structure, and you can't compete on the basis of your costs. You have to be efficient. You have to be very efficient. But you know when people say just bring the labor cost down and then you can export, right? It's just something, we're never going to compete with Bangladesh. Just the cost structure in the economy is at a point, in other words, the cost of living is just too high. So we have to be efficient, there's no doubt about that, but it's not our competitive advantage. Our competitive advantage has to be that we have leading edge products. And again, it may seem like something, well, you know, if you're a community activist, I don't really care about stuff like that, but you should, because that's what's going to drive the economy forward, and that's what generates the jobs, the stability in people's lives, the revenues for government so that they can affect transfers, the ability to, you know, expand education. Where does the money come from otherwise to do that? So these things are two sides of a coin. So the plan gets predicated on a lot of that. Now, the other area that we've done a lot of work on thinking when we were at the HSRC is we looked at every single high growth country in the past 30 years. There aren't that many, frankly, that sustained growth for long periods of time. And we asked where did all the jobs come from, and what happened to income distribution? And incredibly what we learned was that 70 to 100% of net new jobs came from service industries, which I have to say I found incredible. It's not the way I was trained, or that any economist have been trained. And frankly, it's a point that often was ridiculed at that time. I think it's much more mainstream as an understanding these days. But even if you look at the factory of the world, which is China, over the past decade, more than 100% of the jobs have come from services, mainly because of productivity improvement in manufacturing. So they've become more efficient in manufacturing, have shed, relatively speaking, they may have created jobs, but relatively speaking, have shed jobs in manufacturing, and most jobs come from services, even in a place like China. So this is a point that some people even find offensive, partly because it's not what we wish was true. Because the reality is, frankly, service industries drive inequality, and it speaks to the earlier question. And that's because you sort of have a missing middle. You have a skills, sort of higher skills demand, and you have loads and loads of jobs that are low skill. In a way that works well for the economy in South Africa, where we have a lot of low skilled people. So the big job creators were security, domestic work, office cleaners. That's a huge proportion of all the jobs that were created over the past decade. I'm not saying that I wish that were true. I'm just relaying evidence. I think it's a very hard reality, and it's a reality that every single country in the world is facing. There is no country that is not experiencing this right now. And that's because of, again, productivity improvement in goods manufacturing. In all goods, in all physical areas of production, mining, manufacturing, agriculture, labor use is falling. I'll come to you. Labor use is falling in the production process because of technology diffusion is global, whereas services remain labor intensive. And there are new innovations in services, new demands for services, and new services industries. Now, it's not a point that I wish was true. It's just that the evidence is so overwhelming, and there isn't a single country that is broken out of that reality. So I'll come to you. So the key issue here then, from an economic perspective, is that so from a policy perspective, we need to think about these industries as how could they be driving growth? How could we be getting more out of them? The way economists are all trained is to think of services as something that arises because you have manufacturing. Right? You have manufacturing, therefore you need services of different sorts. But the way the world has changed is that services can also drive demand for goods. And we did a lot of research at HSRC. There are papers that are going to be on my website that show the relationship. Now the thing about it is that increasingly it's a policy choice. So in South Africa we often see in our policies that services are treated as an afterthought. But many countries like Korea, Indonesia, China, Malaysia, Turkey have really leveraged, the Philippines, have really leveraged services as an export. So for example, when ShopRite Checkers goes into the continent, if you go into those stores, you'll see South African goods. That's a services export, and it brings in demand for South African manufactured goods. What I've done here as well is just to show an example of what happened in India over a decade. So the two big countries in back office services, and I don't mean call centers, I mean back office processing, financial processing, ICT services, and that sort of thing. Philippines and India led that march over the past decade. In India,